Thank you very much and welcome to this important, as other segments are, this is also very important. Thank you very much and welcome to this segment of the program. Tonight we are talking very serious matters. As you have seen, we've started already talking about VAT, and now we are talking more economics. We are here at the Institute of Economic Affairs where a visiting professor, Dr. Ha Joon Chang, who is a director of the Center for Development Studies at the University of Cambridge, is here, as you may have already heard on the news, and he's been given a lecture. His lecture thesis is entitled Destiny or Policy, Development Prospect for Ghana. Are we underdeveloped because it's a destiny, or because we have had policies that lead us to underdevelopment? Professor Chan is my guest in the studio. Those of you who may not know him, just Google Dr. Ha-Joon Chang. Ha is H-A-Joon is J-O-O-N-N, and Chan is C-H-A-N-G. As you can see on your screen, Google him. He's a reader in political economy of development at the University of Cambridge. In addition to that, he's written numerous journals, articles, book chapters and books, and co-authored and authored so many of them. His main books include The Political Economy of Industrial Policy, Kicking Away the Ladder, that's a very good one. The Bad Samaritans, which I have personally read, a very good one as well. 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, which sounds interesting, but I've not read that. Capitalism and Economics, and etc., etc. He's the winner of the 2003 Gunnar Myrdal Prize and the 2005 Wassily Leontief Prize. He was ranked number 9 in the Prospect Magazine World Thinkers 2014 poll, the 9th most important thinker in the world of 6 billion people. Congratulations, Dr. Chan. And welcome to Ghana. Is this your first time?
Yes, it is, and it's my honor and pleasure to be here.
Where actually do you come from?
I originally come from South Korea. I was born there in 1963, and I moved to Britain when I was 20. Excuse me. When I was 23, and yeah, I did my graduate studies there at the University of Cambridge, where I'm teaching now.
Okay, so you have an excellent qualification to talk about the graduation from underdevelopment to development, because you're from South Korea, and the 60s was when South Korea was turning itself around, and
right.
For us younger generation Ghanaians, we are very envious of South Korea because we have been told that Ghana used to be on the same GDP with South Korea. Is that correct information?
Well, actually, Ghana was richer. You know, in 1961, South Korea had $90 per capita income. Ghana had 190. So Ghana was twice richer than South Korea. Of course,
in 1961.
Yeah, of course. Today, South Korea's income is 20 times that of Ghana's. So that was a complete reversal of fortune. And actually, when Ghana first became independent, it was considered to be a very good development prospect. In the late 90s, until the late 1950s, South Korea was considered a basket case. You know, there's this famous internal memo from the USAID, the American government aid organization, which described South Korea as a bottomless pit in the late 1950s. So that was a completely unexpected turn of events.
And you will tell us tonight what actually turned the ladder around. And you are doing an analysis between destiny and policy. There's a book that has been written. It's edited by Lawrence Harrison and Samuel Hattington. It's entitled Culture Matters, and it's based on a 1999 Harvard Symposium. It's part of an ongoing debate, whether it is the culture of a people that determines their development prospect, or whether it's policy, etc., etc. Policy then means politics. The immediate answer to your thesis, destiny or policy, in the modern world, the digital age, everyone will say it cannot be destiny. It has to be something else. But destiny is also an esoteric, maybe ecclesiastical sort of concept.
Yes,
Couldn't it be? Because historically, we've seen in the Bible, the Christian Bible, where the Christian God blesses countries, blessed the nation of Israel, blessed Abraham, blessed Jacob, and gave them a bountiful harvest. So that's destiny through the esoteric, ecclesiastical, superstitious? Does that not play a role?
Yes, well, I don't believe that it's destiny, but unfortunately, there are lots of people who believe so. You know, for example, explicitly actually comparing Ghana and South Korea, Samuel Huntington, the famous American political scientist who, well, actually became quite notorious for this book, The Clash of Civilizations, he openly says that why did this happen? Because Koreans valued hard work, you know, frugality, education. Ghanaians had other values. You know? Culture matters. You know, he thinks that there's something wrong with the Ghanaians, and that's why Ghana hasn't developed as well as South Korea has. You know, and it's not just him. I mean, the whole book that you mentioned is along the thesis. And there are also a lot of the economists and political scientists who argue that African countries are destined to underdevelop because of climate conditions, because of geography. You know, we can discuss some of this if you want, but basically saying that it's all preset, you know. So the economists have been debating on whether being in Africa just makes you grow more slowly, you know. I find this absurd, but this is unfortunately how many people think.
Why do you think it is policy? And what kind of policy has persisted in Africa that is able to bring Ghana from a GDP better than South Korea 60 years ago, and 60 years later makes it worse? That is able to bring Nigeria from a better prospect 50 years ago and makes it worse. It's able to bring Kenya from a better prospect and makes it worse. It surely is not the same policy that has run through for 60 years in Ghana, or is it the same kind of policy?
No, it's not. You know, well, first of all, why do I think things like culture, climate, and geography do not really determine a country's fate? You know, one obvious counter argument is that, you know, African countries have had these conditions forever. You know, however, in the 1960s and 70s, they grew reasonably well. You know, per capita income in sub-Saharan Africa grew at about 1.52% during that period per year. And in the next 20, 30 years, it was minus 0.7%. You know, and then from the 2000s, it has picked up to 2%. So if Africa's cultural, geographical, and the climate conditions are so bad, how come in some period it grows reasonably well, and in other periods it doesn't? You know. Also, it's not as if today's rich countries had only favorable conditions. You know, a lot of people argue that climate is a burden for development in Africa because it creates a lot of tropical diseases, gives poor quality soil, and so on. Maybe, but don't they also realize that some of the rich countries had very harsh climatic conditions, Scandinavia, Canada, and parts of the United States, where, you know, in winter the oil freezes. You cannot run machines unless you heat it up. You know, that's not very conducive to development. You know, so these arguments based on culture, you know, the climate, geography. These are all the kind of ex post justifications. You know, let's go back to the cultural argument. You know, you go back in history, look at the contemporary records. Before they industrialize and become rich, all countries are described as full of lazy people, stupid people. You know, I can show you.
Even England.
Well, I haven't.
Even England. The Italians used to say that the English were lazy.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, I haven't got that quote on the English, but yes, I mean, that was the case. But I can give you quote by an Australian commenting that in the early 20th century, the Japanese are lazy people with no sense of time, no work ethic. You know, I can give you quotes from mid 19th century where English people would go to Germany and say that these people are stupid, incapable of rational thinking, they are dishonest. They have no sense of time, you know. So, I mean, this apparent cultural reason for certain countries' underdevelopment are actually symptoms of poverty rather than the cause of it. So, all this,
That's an interesting symptoms
Yes.
of poverty rather than the cause of poverty. Symptoms of poverty are lack of time consciousness.
yeah, that's
Symptom of poverty.
That's right. That's one very good example because when you live in an agrarian society, timekeeping doesn't matter that much. I mean, I don't know, I had a bit too much to drink last night. You woke up 40 minutes late. Okay, you go to your field 40 minutes later, and you come back 40 minutes later. You've done the same work, but you don't have to keep time. But if you work in a factory, everyone has to be there at 8:45 so that the production line can run. You have to keep time. My native country, South Korea, is a very good example. Today's young people don't even know this expression, but when I was a young man, 25, 30 years ago, there was this explicit expression called Korean time, which means
there was something called Korean time.
Yeah.
Which means how many hours late?
Yeah.
How many hours late?
1.5 hours, up to 1.5 hours is okay, If it's beyond that, okay, you have to apologize, but 1 hour, 1.5 hours, what does it matter? Yeah? Today, the expression doesn't even exist because the time has become relatively more expensive because people have a lot of material goods, but the time is limited. Yeah? So the time is more valuable. Everyone leads a very hectic life. Yeah? Everyone has to keep time. So now everyone keeps time. Yeah? I mean, I can give you hundreds of these examples.
If you're just joining us, we're having a very interesting conversation with Dr. Chan. And he's just telling us that there's something used to be called Korean time. He's saying also that the attributes and attitudes that are expressed, negative attitudes expressed against development, are actually a symptom of poverty, not the cause of it. Because when you are poor and you live in an agrarian society, an example of time consciousness, for instance, we do have Ghanaian time here, don't we? And Ghanaian time is 2 hours late and that kind of thing. He's telling us that 25, 30 years ago, there was something called Korean time, where you could be 1.5 hours late and it's okay. You can apologize after that, but within 1.5 hours late, it's okay. So he's saying that it's a symptom of poverty. We're going to go into the discussion deeper and task him to explain to us what policy works and what policy doesn't work. Tell your friend to tell his friend that Good Evening Ghana is happening again, and it's a very, very educative session we're having tonight. So, policy. What turned Korea around? What kind of policy?
Yes, the conventional wisdom is that developing countries have to use free trade, free market policy to develop. And since the sort of failure of so-called import substitution industrialization in the 1960s and early 70s, African countries have been constantly told and forced to implement these free trade, free market policies, privatize state-owned enterprises, liberalize trade, deregulate everything. Now, these are policies that South Korea did not use. Throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it has used very aggressive industrial and trade policies that promoted national enterprises. In the beginning, a lot of people thought that this was absolutely insane. For example, in 1965, South Korea made an application to a consortium of international lenders to build a steel mill. And this consortium was advised by the World Bank, who said, don't lend money. Because this country has no business in making steel. They have per capita income less than 5% that of the United States, very little capital, and capital scarce country like South Korea, they shouldn't be making capital intensive products like steel. And this government says they want to set it up as a state-owned enterprise because the private sector agents are not willing to take the risk. They have to import most of the raw materials from far away, Australia, Canada, the United States. To make it worse, they are proposing to appoint as the CEO of former general, this was a military government, whose only business experience was as the CEO of a state-owned tungsten mine. What does this guy know about making steel? So this project is doomed to failure. South Koreans said, okay, if you are not lending us money, we'll get the money somehow, and they actually used colonial reparation from the Japanese to build this steel mill, which within...
Colonial reparation, so they got money from the Japanese?
Yeah.
As a compensation for colonization?
Exactly, yeah.
It's an interesting one.
Yeah, it was nowhere near enough, but at least they gave some money. Yeah. So they built this steel mill, and within, say, 20 years of its establishment, it became one of the most efficient steel makers in the world. Yeah. But during that period, the government, well, ran it as a state-owned monopoly, not to expose it to domestic competition, but more importantly, provided tariff protection, various subsidies. A lot of industries in Korea and before it, Japan are developed in this way. These days, most people probably think Japanese cars are as natural as Scottish salmon or French wine, but the Japanese automobile industry needed 40 years of protection, ban on foreign direct investment, the massive subsidies.
But is a Japanese automobile a state-owned company?
No. But
Toyota and...
Yeah, no, they are all privately owned, but
they got protection.
Supported them. Yeah. So, a lot of companies in that part of the world was developed through these policies, and more interestingly, these policies were not invented in East Asia. It was actually invented in Britain and the United States, which people think are countries that invented free trade. No, I mean, Britain was the first country that, as you mentioned earlier, I mean, in the beginning, Britain was behind countries like Italy and the Netherlands in terms of its industrial technology. So from the 17th century, they protected and promoted their national enterprises. Later, the United States had even more protectionist policies. Between the 1830s and the end of the Second World War, for 120 years, the U.S. was the most protected economy in the world. So actually, it's shocking because very few of today's rich countries, the only obvious exception is the Netherlands. Very few of these countries actually develop on the basis of policies they recommend to developing countries today. They never used free trade when they were developing countries. Some of them are vastly protectionist. The average tariff rate of the United States during that 120-year period was at 40-50%. Today, developing countries typically have 10% tariff rate.
That's why you call them bad Samaritans.
Exactly. Yeah, they say they are helping you, but actually they are recommending exactly the wrong policies.
So let's look at two aspects of what you are talking about. So you seem to be proposing state capitalism as a way to start the wheels of development in underdeveloped countries, especially those in Africa. State capitalism. So the states must drive industry as state-owned, nationalized companies.
Oh, no, I'm not.
And where it is private, the state must give them protection.
That's right. No, I'm not saying that there's a need for necessarily state-owned enterprises, although its use is much more widespread than people think. Take the case of Singapore. When people hear the word Singapore, they all think that this is a free trade country, welcoming foreign investors. It is, but they will never realize that 90% of land in Singapore is owned by the government. 85% of housing is provided by government-owned housing corporation. And 22% of GDP is produced by state-owned enterprises.
In Singapore?
Yeah. So,
Okay, so the solution is state capitalism?
No. I wouldn't necessarily call it state capitalism. What I'm recommending is that, the market alone in developing countries does not generate development. The state has to get involved. The exact form of what it does could be different according to the country. Japan used very few state-owned enterprises. Singapore used a lot. Thailand used a lot. France used a lot. Korea used much less. I mean,
let's try
so
and
the
understand.
policy combinations should be different.
Let's try and understand what you are against. The free trade liberalization. What does that mean to an ordinary person who doesn't understand economics? What take any example, say this bottle of water, and use that to explain what free trade and liberalization of the market is, and why we shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah, well, the water is probably not a great example in that respect. Because,
should we take cocoa?
Yeah, most countries can produce water, but yes, take the case of cocoa. You know, so the prevailing economic theory is that Ghana is better at producing cocoa than producing other things, so it should specialize in cocoa, yeah? And should keep the economy open so that the consumers can buy the cheapest things that are available in the world market. Yeah? Now, in the short run, this is fine, you know, because you are relatively good at something, so you should specialize in it, yeah? So that you can maximize your output. And then with that output, you want to have the greatest possible choice of where you import where you buy things from. Yeah? If it's a domestic producer that can give you the cheapest, fine. But if it's the Chinese, the Koreans, the Americans, yes, you should be better off buying those things. Yeah? So in the short term, that's the best policy. But the trouble is that when you want to develop the economy, you have to remember that you have to generate your income to be able to exercise your the choice as a consumer, and the more income you need, the more income you have, you can buy more things. Yeah? But how are you going to generate more income? You have to produce things that are valued highly. You know, there are 50 countries that can produce cocoa. You know, Ghana cannot get that much high price. Yeah? But if you can produce flat screen TV like only Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and a few other countries can produce, then you can earn a lot of money with it. Yeah? So basically the idea is that the developing countries need to grow producers who can produce these things. Now this takes time. You know, you cannot expect a Ghanaian company today to be able to produce a flat screen TV. This was the same in the countries like Japan and Korea. You know, in the beginning they just couldn't produce things that could compete with the foreign products. You know, I see a lot of Toyota cars here, but back in 1955, Toyota produced 35,000 cars per year. In the same year, the biggest American company produced 3.5 million cars, 100 times more cars. Yeah? The US as a whole produced 7 million cars. Yeah? So in the beginning, Toyota was a joke. Yeah? So at that time, it made perfect sense for Japan to have free trade in cars so that Japan could export things like silk, which at the time was the biggest export item of Japan, and buy better American cars. Yeah? But the Japanese position, which actually is a position that was followed by virtually all the developed countries, was that, yeah, today we are better off buying American cars, but if we cannot produce things like cars, yeah, things like steel and so on, where are we going to get the money to import things? We have to grow our own producers. Yeah? This idea is known as the idea of infant industry protection. In the same way that you send your kid to school and give it education, you are providing temporary protective barriers to your industries until they can grow up and compete with the world's best producers. Very interestingly, this idea was theorized, although the practice had existed before. This idea was theorized by the very first finance minister, known as Treasury Secretary of the United States of America, known as Alexander Hamilton. That's the guy you see on the $10 bill. Yeah? So when Hamilton became
the Federalist.
That's right. Hamilton became the Treasury Secretary. He submitted this report to the U.S. Congress saying, of course, that a lot of people argue that America should have free trade, sell the tobacco and cotton to Europe, and import better manufactured product from Europe. Hamilton said, no, we shouldn't do that. We should grow our own industries. Industries in infancy.
So if I understand what you're saying, you're saying, for instance, that so here is Ghana. You have cocoa. Everyone knows that you get cocoa naturally, so it's your strong point. It's, as they say, your competitive strength. What point you're making is that don't just focus on your competitive strength, because that alone does not create an industry.
That's right.
So you can go into car manufacturing, go into the things that people need. You can go into milk production, you can go into sugar production, supported by the state. And within the period that you are producing, in the first period, you will not be competitive with other sugar producers, but protect the industry, stop the others from coming in, let your people consume this one, keep developing it, and over 30 years, you'll be a great producer of sugar the same way, or a great producer of rice, the same way South Korea is. That's what you're advocating.
That's right. No, but it's interesting that you said that cocoa's natural. Is cocoa natural?
It comes to us. It grows here.
No, but it came from Mexico, yeah? Who brought it here?
Well, we know
the British brought it here. So
there are theories. No, we had it before the British came. We did have it. Yes, and we do have gold also. We had it before the British came.
Cocoa is from Central America.
It came from a place called Fernando Po. There are theories now that it came also from Brazil. But it came anyway. But we were dominant in the world, and we have continued to be for a very long time. That's why I call it a competitive advantage product. Okay.
Well, anyway,
so is that your theory, though, just to understand, so that our viewers can understand what the theory you're proposing is?
No, but exactly. I mean, you got it. I mean, basically, you want to get into high productivity sectors, and it takes time to do that.
So you protect.
If you left it to free market, all the Ghanaian producers will be wiped out in those industries. Because there are already Koreans, the Japanese, the Brazilians who are producing.
So if you talk, say, fabric, textile, so the things that I'm wearing right now, my shoes probably imported, my socks is imported, the fabric for this is imported, this is local. So you're saying that I should have been wearing everything local.
No,
and we should get into the space of producing shoes, making shoes, and stop the British company or the Italian company from bringing shoes here so our people can buy the shoes and grow a shoe industry. That's the point?
Well, I don't believe in producing everything for yourself. I mean, in the 60s and 70s, there's this idea that you have to produce everything for yourself.
Not everything.
Yeah, that's nonsensical.
So which areas? Which sensitive areas? Which areas do we choose?
No, you have to have a kind of portfolio of industries. So at the moment, you are mainly specialized in the natural resource-based things. But there are some industries which are relatively easy to get into. Probably they don't need a lot of protection or subsidies. A little help from the government about, say, technology to dye the textile or improve the design or things like that, or help them with export marketing. So there are some relatively easy industries that can be promoted with relatively little government help.
Let me ask you about food.
But there'll be other industries which need serious strategy, serious investment, serious protection and subsidies.
So we have to choose, pick and choose. Let me ask you about a direct question about what you would have done if you were president of Ghana, for instance. Okay, so we import into Ghana frozen foods like chicken and commodities like rice, almost $1 billion every year. And we import these from the United States, from South Korea, and from other places like that. What will be your prescription on dealing with an industry like that? Should we start creating a big poultry industry in Ghana? It's easy to create poultry industry. So the government supports you, and you get day-old chicks, and you get machines, and you get a farm that produces maize to feed the chicken and all of that. And you will be creating almost a $1 billion industry. Is that your prescription?
Oh, why not?
So you stop the importation?
Yeah, well, the one problem with this is that things like chicken from EU is heavily subsidized. So the world market is already skewed. So why should you kind of compete on equal terms? Because theirs is already subsidized. So you could say that since we are subsidizing your producers, we are going to subsidize ours. And yes,
should we allow their producers to bring their chicken into Ghana?
Sorry?
Should we allow EU producers to bring their chicken into Ghana?
Well, if it's necessary for kind of survival of development of local chicken industry, I don't see why you shouldn't impose certain restrictions or tariffs.
But we can't do that within the context of WTO. We cannot do that. And now we have signed the Economic Partnership Agreement, which you know about.
Yeah, EPA is...
so we shouldn't have signed the EPA?
No, you shouldn't have. Yeah, but, you know, WTO doesn't necessarily ban those things. You know?
Well, I mean, if we impose a trade restriction, we will be flagged that Ghana is imposing a trade restriction.
Yeah, but you can impose a trade restriction on some legitimate grounds. You know, I mean, the U.S. that imposes kind of tariffs on the products that they classified as being dumped. Yeah. Okay. So there are provisions for anti-dumping tariff. Yeah.
But you know, there's
countervailing subsidies. So you could say that, well, the Europeans are subsidizing their chicken, so we have to countervail that with extra tariff. You can do that.
There's not been any other example of protectionism and state capitalism that has turned around the development story apart from Southeast Asia. And since Southeast Asia, we have not yet had another example. Some analysts believe that it is because the context of Southeast Asia is different and it cannot be replicated easily in other parts of the world. That the advantage is that Southeast Asia has population, so massive population, so you have a big market. So within the context of Southeast Asia, Singapore might be small, and Malaysia might be small, South Korea might be small, but Japan is big. Together they are big. China is around the corner. So you have a population that easily is over 100 million people. And so producing your own material and using the protectionism tactics works in Southeast Asia. Also, Southeast Asia had a giant like Japan who was willing to help and became the focal point around which all of these countries that we call them the Asian tigers, around which these countries evolved through development. You can't find that in West Africa. You will not find that in East Africa. To start with, we do not consume the same things even when it's food. We do not speak the same language. But we do have a lot of commodities in Africa. Almost all the minerals are in Africa. Cocoa is in Africa. Oil is in Africa. So it becomes a more challenging context to try and duplicate or replicate Southeast Asia within the African situation. What's your take on that as we end?
But you know, you have to realize that no one has ever succeeded by exactly copying what went on before. You know, I mean, all countries have different conditions. Yeah, I think having a large market helps you because it means that even if you have tariff protection, there'll be a relatively high degree of internal competition. But smaller countries have overcome this by entering the export market from very early on. Yeah? So the South Korea and Taiwan gave a lot of export subsidies. Unfortunately, export subsidies are banned in the WTO these days, but there are other ways to help your exporters. You know, if market size was so important, how do you explain that, you know, tiny countries like Finland and Norway and so on develop with quite high protective barriers, you know? So yes, I mean, these things matter, but you know, there are ways to get around them. And also, yes, the global policy environment has changed quite a lot with the WTO, with the EPA and so on. But, you know, it's not as if everything is bad, you know. I mean, I sometimes joke that the WTO is the greatest friend of lazy government officials in developing countries, because when the minister says, why don't you implement such and such policy, all you have to say is, our minister, that's banned by the WTO. The minister is not going to look up 1,500 pages of WTO treaty to say, no, actually it is allowed. Actually, a lot of things can be done. You know, you can still use tariffs.
So there's also a debate about Africa, whether import substitution, which has to do a bit with the barriers that you're talking about, or should it be export-led growth, which you have just talked about? Which should it be?
Well, I say that the dichotomy between those two is itself wrong, because you have to combine export with import substitution. Let me explain why. First of all, if you're a developing country without good ability to export, whether it's at the beginning raw material or later more sophisticated products, you cannot develop. Because as a developing country, you have to import technologies. In the end, I mean, technologies are what makes you poor. You have to import technologies in the form of machines and licensing and stuff, and you need foreign exchanges for that. and you have to earn the foreign exchange. So, I openly say that without export, there is no economic development. However, that doesn't mean that this is the common confusion. That doesn't mean that you have to have free trade policy, because in order to succeed in export, you, in the long run, need to keep growing new industries. Because, for example, in the 1980s, South Korea was producing 90% of world Nike shoes, because it has cheap labor, highly exploited labor. But by the late 1980s, the wages started growing, and today Korea produces only 2% of Nikes. So if Korea didn't, while exporting cheap labor stuff like Nike, if Korea didn't also develop automobile industry and electronics industries at the time, Korea's development would have ended in the 1980s. So you need to keep growing new infant industries, and that requires constant investment and protection and subsidies. And for this reason, you have to combine export promotion and import substitution. You cannot say that we only protect and do import substitution, we only export. Well, some countries have tried such strategies, and they all failed because the people didn't understand that these two are closely interlinked.
Finally, let's talk about politics and whether the politics of a country, the way in which it's structured, also affects development. We in Ghana go to the polls to fight elections every 4 years. We have been doing that since 1992. Invariably, every 4 years during election, the growth of our economy stagnates a little bit. Not much happens. A new government comes, it takes a while. So the year of the election, there's excessive government spending. Presidents always promise that it will not be, but it turns out that it is, because it's spending on elections, formal and informal. The Electoral Commission's bill to run the elections is humongous, because everyone is suspicious that another will steal the election. So we keep bringing in new dimensions to protect the ballot, and that costs a lot of money. We do that every 4 years. We also realize that the Southeast Asian countries don't seem to have this periodic election situation where they are always going to the polls to vote, because a lot of them operate the Westminster system where there's a prime minister, and Lee Kuan Yew was there for 20-something years or so. So would you say, like Paul Collier says, that elections, periodic elections, and the kind of politics that we practice could also undermine the development agenda?
Yes, I mean, there's nothing that is only good and nothing that's only bad. So, I'm a Democrat. I have lived under a military dictatorship for the first 27 years of my life in South Korea. So I know how bad it is, and I don't wish that dictatorship on anyone. But, democracy can be abused and can be costly. So you have to find a way to run it.
Is the American system better for our society, or the other system?
Oh, not necessarily. I mean, on the whole, I think the Westminster-style parliamentary system is better. But different countries have different histories. In Korea, we have a presidential system in which the president has a lot of power. But we have very recently managed to kick out a corrupt president through mass mobilization. So,
how did he go out? He resigned.
She was impeached in the parliament, but
didn't he have the majority in parliament?
Yes, but when her corruption scandal broke out, there was a constant popular pressure. I mean, for like 9 weeks straight, there were more than every weekend there were more than 1 million people on the street calling for impeachment. And yes, I mean this shows that the viable democracy also requires a population that is awake and aware.
How many years do you run elections? Every year? Every 4 years?
Every 5 years we have a presidential election. Every 4 years we have the parliamentary election.
Also, the terms of parliament and president are not coterminous.
They are different. Staggered. So No, I mean, no system is perfect, but yes, I think that you have to think carefully not to create a system where power is too concentrated or is too much of a winner takes all. I mean, good side of the presidential system is that the president can really push certain things, but unfortunately, it means concentration power and concentration of power. And therefore, the increased chance of corruption and abuse of power.
Are you optimistic about the case in Ghana?
Oh, I think, Ghana is now, well, shall we say that having its second chance because...
Second chance?
Yeah. When it first became independent, everyone was very hopeful. You know, it was one of the leaders of the developing world. And Kwame Nkrumah was very respected all over the world. Now, since the 70s, especially in the 80s, you had very bad politics and very bad economic management. But now I think the countries that become stable and as luck would have it, you now have an extra economic cushion in the form of oil revenue. So I think this is a time when you really have to think seriously whether you are going to keep producing cocoa and gold forever, or one day, maybe 40 years later, maybe 60 years later, you will have the companies like Toyota and Samsung.
Dr. Chan, thank you very much, and welcome to Ghana. We say Akwaba. That was food for thought from Dr. Chan. Good night.